Maundy Thursday comes at such a strange time in our lives, both here and all across the world, as we practice physical distancing, are unable to see loved ones or hug newborn members of our families, or even to reach out and touch the shoulder of a person in grief at the graveside. These are indeed unprecedented times. Tonight we begin what should be the holiest week in the Church's year, the great 3 days of Easter, which we call the Triduum. And yet, for so many of us, we will be doing so alone. I've not missed an Easter Triduum in 20 years, and I know that many of you will be feeling a deep sense of grief at not being able to be in your church. But we know that we must stay at home and practice not so much social isolation, but what Bishop Lindsay Irwin is calling love at a distance. And it was at this very service a number of years ago now that I preached my first sermon. I began that sermon with the image of gathering people around the family kitchen table to share a meal, and I recalled the childhood memory of coming home from school to smell my mother's home-cooked soup boiling away on the stove. The generosity and hospitality of my mother in particular is part of my story, and indeed an influence on my vocational path. Storytelling is an integral part of the way we relate to one another and forms a huge part of our daily interactions. Over these coming days, though at a distance, we engage in the collective exercise of storytelling. We tell our story that is not unfamiliar. We know that we cannot reach the empty tomb before we have been through the grief and pain of Good Friday and the lull and eerie quiet of Holy Saturday. As we move toward these days, we begin the journey by being steeped in our story, our salvation history. This common history forms the very purpose of our gathering together around the altar, day by day, week by week, year by year. We hear of the earliest Passover when the Lord commands Moses and Aaron to take a lamb for each household. If the household wasn't big enough, they joined with their neighbour, and to eat it on the 14th day with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. The blood of the lamb on the lintel of the house indicated that the Lord should pass over that place, leaving all people within that house safe. Paul reminds us of the handing on of the collective history when he exhorts the people of Corinth to remember the Last Supper Jesus shared with his disciples. Our gospel transports us to that same Jewish ritual when Jesus shares a meal with his friends, his companions on the way. However, this time it is different. This time Jesus knows that this will be his last meal. And so he spells out even more clearly for his disciples how they are to continue his mission in the world. For I have set you an example, says Jesus, that you also ought to wash one another's feet. And what becomes the purpose of this whole exercise? What is the purpose of washing feet, of breaking bread? Love. During the weeks of Lent, when we have still been able to gather for worship, we've been challenged to think of Lenten disciplines that stretch us to think beyond ourselves, to contemplate the presence of God in other people. We have been challenged to find the face of Christ in our neighbour, to think of others before ourselves, and to keep company with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And tonight, we are invited to sit at the table, just as the first disciples did, to eat the Passover meal, joining as one household. Tonight we are reminded of the importance of living by the values we preach. Tonight we are reminded that our Lord himself came not to be served, but to serve. If we could gather together tonight, we would engage symbolically in the same actions of the Messiah, the King, the disciples' leader and friend, as he got up from the table, took off his outer robe, tied a towel around himself, and began to wash the disciples' feet. In doing this, Jesus demonstrated to his disciples then, and to us, his disciples now, how to serve others in total humility. Unless I wash you, you have no share with me, he says. In this light, our Lenten discipline of looking beyond ourselves must not be a discipline we limit only to Lent. You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet, Jesus tells us. There is a challenge offered to us, should we choose to accept it, to look beyond ourselves, not just in Lent, but in each and every day of our lives. Jesus shows us the greatest example of service and humility, calling us to wash the feet of others, the unsung heroes of our community, the supermarket workers, the rubbish collectors, all those who work while we must isolate. We are called to wash the feet of asylum seekers, of refugees, of the outcast in our community, the heroin junkie in the street, the homeless person sleeping rough, those whom we would rather forget. For I have set you an example, that you also should do as I have done to you. Amen.